I suppose one thing that kind of occurs to me in response to what you're saying and what I've seen is that within such extreme conditions as this condition, pandemic, global lockdown, all the sort of the blockages that we've experienced, how do we resist the categorical imperative of the now? Because I think we absolutely have to resist, because that's what research is for me. It's the act of resisting the categorical imperative of the now. So not to always be reactive, not to always say, this dictates and then I have to do this. So let's say teaching within a pandemic doesn't in any way kind of negate the need to know. One needs to know. Maybe one needs to know slightly differently. Maybe the atmosphere of knowing needs to change and be opened or sort of shifted sideways. But it's the tension within conditions and the need to not react to them, I think, is the arena of research. Because there's a philosopher not well known that I'm very attached to called Ernst Bloch. And he said, hope lies in the not yet. Research is the state of the not yet, right? We know that there's something there, but we don't quite know what it is. We're not sure what our tools are and what we can apply to the questions that we have. And so you said, Rafal, about needing to also change those conditions. But I'm actually quite wary of that. I'm quite wary of rescuing a condition, right? Before I really understand how that condition has formed my thinking. Because it seems that it's more important to change our thinking, because that's where we have agency. And over conditions, we don't always have agency. So I think that's
I think we started talking about this yesterday in one way or another, that perhaps refraining from directly and immediately responding to something triggers the possibility for completely different things to emerge. And that's the beauty of, I think, why and how the Creators Collective in this situation has emerged, because we were looking away from some things, but also seeking out to engage in dialogue with others in order to get some help and to get some support from each other. And it allowed us possibilities that wouldn't have been there in the initial set of conditions. So it enlarged the possibilities of action. And I was wondering whether that can be conceptualized as when thinking about the search of collective forms of critically engaging, of critically discussing things, showing things, exhibiting material, and producing events, the rise of collectives, whether that again is some moment of enlarging the circle of our own conditions and allowing us for other things to flourish. I'm not sure whether that's a speculation that is a shot too far, but I think the way in which we are thinking of activities that are not immediately demand-driven, that has a social and a collective dimension. And so I do see some links here. Not sure whether you share the thought, or how you think of this.
I'm still processing this concept of research and whether that process, the word process with research, and what would that negating the action now and always this direction, whether those two words put together.
I think to sort of engage with what Peter has said, the research is the exact opposite of expertise, right? So expertise is territorialized, it's owned, it's named, it's kind of subject to an economy. And the expert seems to me to be involved largely in policing the boundaries of what they know. That's kind of, I think, what the work of expertise does. The sort of research seems to me by nature collective, because if the knowledge that you're dealing with is not privatized and segregated and owned, right, then you are by definition operating collectively. The sort of the boundaries, but not just in terms of, okay, not all interdisciplinary models, a bit of this and a bit of that. I'm thinking about the kind of friction that comes from interaction with something you really don't know and you have no tools to understand, and yet it's a productive friction, right? So the sort of collectivity is not necessarily a collectivity that one would know how to build. And I think you've probably encountered that because there are so many knowledges here, and you're probably not terribly familiar with all of them. And so I think that the sort of, and that's one of the reasons I'm so fond of Ernst Bloch and his notion of the not yet. Because you arrive at something and you think, yes, there is a huge urgency here that I don't know how to approach. And I also don't know whose help to get in order to approach it. So collective, which is mostly kind of being in proximity with other people, other knowledges, other politics, other projects, and so on. Collectivity is really not a shared enterprise. It's a set of emergent proximities. It always is. And that's the looseness of it, that's the interest of it. That's what I would think.
If I may echo that from our own experience, I mean, why we, for instance, have come to be so invested in inventing these platforms of collective action has, of course, to do with the recognition that the conditions that we experience are not conditions that exist isolated. So all the conditions that we aim to address are always connected with other conditions. So that becomes a necessity to engage in these collective processes of research in order to also address that the conditions themselves are networked as such, and so there's a requirement to approach them and encourage them from many different perspectives simultaneously. So it's about this kind of shadow play that we try to understand the situation that something is vielgestaltig in that sense, and it has many different gestalts and then in many different forms at the same time, and that requires it's a property of the conditions that we work with to some extent, that we are required to invent these collective processes of research. But then one of the kind of real challenges in doing that is always to produce a form of that collective process of research, and that is necessary from my point of view because in order to advance our understanding we need to produce new sets of references. So it's about these kind of references that allow us to think about things differently. And so I'm really interested in how, for instance, the Curators Collective could be understood as a process that has produced a new set of references that allows us to think about the Biennale, for instance, very, very differently. And it's through all this, it's through these materializations and this giving form to the process of collective action that it has become a new set of references. And so we do this kind of wonderful lineup, and I'm really humbled and we find it so wonderful, the contributions. But we actually have a few minutes, and I know that we have colleagues from the Curators Collective around, and we have a revolving mic. So if any one of you wanted to pitch in and share a thought at this point, if that's not like a sudden attack on you, into more than welcome. Would anybody that would like to say something, share their thoughts of the great collective our colleagues around?
I can say something.
So you have a mic.
Thank you. I mean, that was really interesting. Really. I mean, I kind of feel that the CC is kind of irritated. Having been part of this for 2 years. And, you know, basically we're doing it, we not really know the consequence what it means to do it. So, the kind of, and the idea of the references in the way that we're also creating each other's references, we're talking on the basis, a whole different new basis to create this knowledge that we create in the CC. You know, and it's been incredibly efficient. But yeah, so I mean, the condition of the Biennale is also something that hasn't been really clear. It's also something that we constantly try to figure out. So because we're constantly in communication, we're constantly trying to articulate it, but it constantly changes, and you know, in that way, we're constantly not also ever able to really put our finger on what is the condition that we're in with the Biennale. So, yeah.
I think it's also the fact that we all been partially in academia, and there is such a strong concept of what is research, and it's very different from what you're projecting. So we're so bounded by this preconception of research, and this is a moment. It's also happening. It's creating. It's in action in a different sense that we're not producing. We didn't have a one direction of purpose, but we were in discussion, in dialogue, and searching for new fields of getting to know and understanding different ways of approaching. It was completely, I mean, we didn't know, there was no direction to a code that we can follow to create this and have this continue for more than a year and a half. So I think that's the thing also with the word platform, where in different contexts of different culture has a complete different notions of what it is. So I think this questioning of even this whole process, we could also relate to the notion of research is very interesting also for me, and it's something that also has to be critically looked into, where the field of academia kind of brands it in such a way that it's not accessible to the normal people, where we say, oh, this is research, means it's something else, like it's untouchable. And this is a shift of that idea in a way that what we're proposing. Yeah.
You say something first.
I think we're running out of time.
I would be maybe building up on what Haiwan also mentioned with Alex. The fact that maybe research in here could be understood as really a practical engagement somehow, because to be honest, first of all, when we met, we didn't know each other. We had to understand what our resources are and what can we do together. And only in the process of acting and somehow testing the limits, testing it with Biennale, sending out mails, asking for the things, we could access this sort of knowledge. It wasn't like available through any instruction. Maybe the ones who are engaged with the institution for a long time already have this knowledge about how institutions work and what are the limits of this work. But at the same time, without knowing these limits, we're basically testing this through the action and testing it through this sort of engagement upon which we have an idea. Let's see how the institution responds to that. And only from that point of view, we notice what are the urgencies and possibilities, to change it. Of course, there has been some discussions about the obsolescence, for example, of the idea of the nation-state pavilion on the grounds as these. And to those who are engaged in the culture of Biennale Architettura, of course, in here, know it. But of course, for those who come just for the first time, who start to notice it, the problems of this kind and the urgency of collaboration and of more and more international relationships inside of the pavilions and then between the pavilions themselves is being visible. It's like something that cannot be hidden because it comes natural to the top. So from this point of view, that if the notion of research is changing and is being maybe much more practically treated, not in academical way, but by the fact that simply even on the everyday level we are researching information to make our basic decisions about the food that we choose, about the traveling, about the, like people who are in the precarious situation, in fact, they are good researchers because they have to know what are the limits which they can afford, of course. And from that point of view, of course, the platform, which is the Curators Collective, is not legalized institutional body which can engage based on the legal, let's say, the legal framework, which is why we also try to understand what a platform can do, which is very fluid, no?
And I think maybe in response to Alex's question, one thing that strikes me is, yes, you don't necessarily know each other, now you know each other, you did it before, or you do different things and so on. The real issue here is what you face. You're facing a proposition of how shall we live together, on this earth. And it's not really very important where you come from. What's important is what you face and how you stand up to that challenge and what it actually elicits from you, right? Because it elicits things from you that you may not have known you had. So the sort of the notion of who do we face, what do we face, is actually what produces collectivity. I think that's where collectivity, it's not necessarily a joint identity or a joint cause or so on. It's the fact that confronted with a challenge, and COVID is a challenge, and complete environmental collapse of the planet is a challenge, that's where we get formed. And that's exactly where expertise cannot stand up to the challenge. So I think that's what I would say, that we always need to try and recognize what are we facing.
Well, on that note, one of the more banal conditions that we have to work with is that we are running out of time. But it's been such a pleasure and such a joy listening to all of you and hearing your thoughts. I'm just taken, blown away. It's been so rich and so, it's so meaningful for me. So, and I hope it's been the same experience for all of you here. And I also have the great pleasure to inform you that we have 2 more fantastic rounds of conversations lined up, and you're all very welcome to hang around and stay with us. We just have a little break to get everything sorted, but we shall continue and reconvene in probably 5 minutes' time. So thank you all for joining us, and please join me also in thanking our fantastic panel.
That was beautiful. I mean, it's so perfect.
This is really feels tragically it's never a question of what our identity is, which law are we facing, and can that law even recognize?
There were 2 things that was big discussion. One was getting rid of the national pavilions, and the other one is actually getting rid of the distinctions. For example, architecture used to be part of art, and
Until the 80s.
yes. I was studying the split in '78, and the thing is that that's where collectors, a collective, curators collective could be very interesting. It's like, how much of this has been artificially imposed in the years.
Yes. And it's open-ended. I mean, the debate.
Hi, Rob. You like that?